Now, a new analysis shows that the 6-ton iconic altar stone at the heart of Stonehenge originated from northeastern Scotland rather than southwest Wales.
The Stonehenge mystery has been solved, and the answer is stranger than any AI claim. What stunned the experts came not from a machine, but from a chemistry lab in 2024, revealing that one stone had traveled from the far north of Scotland. That single finding rewrote what we thought we knew about the people who raised those stones 5,000 years ago. So how did a Scottish stone end up at the center of an English circle? The stone that traveled the length of Britain. It ended up there because someone carried it more than 700 kilometers across the length of Britain, roughly 5,000 years ago. For most of a century, scholars believed that the altar stone, a 6-ton greenish sandstone lying flat at the very center of Stonehenge, had come from Wales, like the smaller blue stones around it. That assumption held for so long that almost no one thought to challenge it. Then, in August 2024, a team of geologists published a study in the journal Nature that shattered it. Overnight, a century of geological certainty collapsed. They did not chip a new piece off the monument. They worked from 2 tiny fragments of the altar stone already held in museum collections, and they analyzed the microscopic mineral grains inside them, dating each grain to build a chemical and geological fingerprint. That fingerprint matched only one place in the British Isles, the old red sandstone of the Orcadian Basin in the northeast of Scotland. Not Wales, Scotland. And not just over the nearest border, but from the opposite end of the island. The sheer distance is the whole point of the puzzle. The result was, by the researchers' own account, staggering. One of the co-authors, Dr. Robert Ixer of University College London, called it a genuinely shocking result, adding that if the physics and geology were correct, then the altar stone was simply Scottish. His colleague, Professor Chris Kirkland, pointed out what it implied: a level of societal coordination in Neolithic Britain that no one had credited these people with. This was not a machine finding a hidden pattern. It was hard science, overturning 100 years of assumption. The stone had been hiding its origin in plain sight the entire time, and it raised an immediate physical problem. 750 kilometers is the straight-line distance. By any realistic route, over hills and forests and rivers, it is far longer, and this was centuries before the wheel reached Britain. The likeliest explanation is that the stone went most of the way by sea. That alone implies boats, crews, and coordination across hundreds of miles of coastline. So what would possess a Neolithic people to fetch one specific stone from the opposite end of the island and haul it to a field in southern England? That question does not have a clean answer, and it gets harder the closer you look. Because the altar stone is not the only stone at Stonehenge that came from an improbable distance. It is not even the only one with a secret origin. The monument is built from pieces pulled from 3 very different corners of Britain, and each of those journeys was a deliberate choice, and none of them was an accident. So where exactly did the rest of Stonehenge's stones come from? 3 quarries, 1 monument from 3 places, each hundreds of miles apart. The biggest stones at Stonehenge, the towering sarsens that form the outer circle, and the famous trilithons, look like they belong to the local ground, and in a sense, they almost do. In 2020, a team led by the geologist David Nash traced them to West Woods, a patch of woodland in Wiltshire about 15 miles north of the monument. That is a serious haul for a 25-ton stone, but it is local compared with what came next. The big stones, it turns out, were the easy part of the puzzle. Nash cracked the sarsen puzzle with a single, improbable artifact. In 1958, a drilling during restoration work had pulled a core sample out of one of the sarsens, and that cylinder of stone had ended up, of all places, in a home in Florida. It was returned to England in 2019. By matching its chemical fingerprint to stone across the region, The team pinpointed West Woods. The big stones had been quietly announcing their birthplace for decades, locked inside their own chemistry. It took a lost sample, traveling to America and back to read it. Then there are the blue stones, the smaller stones that sit inside the Sarsen ring. These were the first stones ever raised at Stonehenge, and they came from much farther away, from the Preseli Hills of West Wales, about 140 miles distant. Researchers have since found the actual quarries where they were cut, places with names like Carn Godog and Craig Rosie Fellin, and they date the quarrying to around 3,400 to 3000 BC, centuries before the Great Sarsens went up. Someone was quarrying and shaping these stones long before Salisbury Plain was involved. The blue stones are mostly igneous rock, harder and darker than the Sarsens, and several ring like a bell when struck, a detail that fueled later theories about healing. So picture what is standing on Salisbury Plain, a ring of Sarsens from 15 miles north, a horseshoe and circle of blue stones from 140 miles west, and at the very center, lying flat, a single sandstone block from 750 kilometers to the north, in Scotland. Stonehenge is not built from its own landscape. It is a patchwork, stitched together from across an entire island. Nothing about it was random, and every stone was selected, but the blue stones from Wales hide an even stranger story than their journey. The quarries that produced them were working the stone long before Stonehenge was a twinkle in anyone's eye, which raises an awkward question. If the stones were cut in Wales around 3400 BC and Stonehenge's first phase was 3000 BC, that leaves an awkward gap of 4 centuries. So were the Welsh stones brand new when they arrived, or had they already lived another life? The circle that was recycled, they had already lived another life. For years, the archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson and his team had been digging in the Preseli Hills, trying to understand why anyone would drag stones 140 miles when every other stone circle in Britain was built from its local rock. The answer, they came to believe, was that the stones were not chosen at random. They were already sacred because they already belonged to a monument. And monuments, in the Neolithic mind, were not things you abandoned. On a windswept Welsh hillside stood the remains of an older stone circle called Waun Mon. When Parker Pearson's team excavated it, they found empty sockets where standing stones had once risen and then been pulled out. The circle had been dismantled, not destroyed, taken apart, stone by stone for transport, and the details matched Stonehenge with eerie precision. Waun Mon had the same diameter as the ditch that encloses Stonehenge, about 110 meters, and it was aligned to the same midsummer solstice sunrise, 2 circles on opposite sides of Britain, oriented to the same sunrise. One of the surviving Stonehenge bluestones has an unusual cross-section, a particular shape, and that exact shape matches one of the empty sockets at Waun Mon. Even the chippings left in that socket are the same rock type as the Stonehenge stone. To the researchers, the conclusion was clear. Sometime around 3000 BC, the people of West Wales took their stone circle apart, carried its stones 175 miles east, and re-erected them on Salisbury Plain. It is one of the most remarkable instances of long-distance stone movement in the ancient world. An empty circle in Wales, a filled one in England. Parker Pearson put it simply. He said they took their stones and their ancestral identities with them. The migration shows up in the bones too. Isotope analysis of people buried at Stonehenge in its earliest phase suggests that a meaningful share of them came from the West, possibly West Wales itself. The monument was not just built by locals. It was built in part by immigrants carrying the pieces of their old home. When they left Wales, they did not leave their history behind. The isotope evidence means we can trace not just the stones, but the people. So one of the great mysteries of Stonehenge, why go so far for the stones, may have a human answer. They were not fetching raw material. They were bringing their ancestors with them. But that raises a deeper question about what those stones were for once they stood on Salisbury Plain. Because the evidence increasingly suggests that Stonehenge was not, first and foremost, a temple to the sky. It was a place of the dead. So what was actually happening inside that ring of stones, the domain of the dead? What was happening, mostly, was burial. Inside the outer earthwork, set into a ring of 56 pits known as the Aubrey Holes, archaeologists have found the cremated remains of somewhere between 100 and 200 people. This was not an afterthought. In its earliest phase, Stonehenge appears to have functioned above all as a cemetery, and a very large one, the biggest known in Britain from its time. For its first 500 years, before a single sarsen was raised, the site was essentially a graveyard. A major clue to its purpose came from an unexpected source. In the late 1990s, a Malagasy archaeologist named Ramilisanina offered a comparison that reframed the whole site. He had come to visit Stonehenge, and the comparison had not occurred to the British team before he said it. In Madagascar, he explained, people build in stone for the ancestors because stone is permanent, and in wood for the living because wood decays like life. The British team, led by Mike Parker Pearson, took that insight back to Salisbury Plain, and suddenly the landscape made sense. A simple comparison from a different culture had unlocked a British one. Stonehenge, made of permanent stone, became the domain of the dead. A short walk and a river away stood Durrington Walls, a huge settlement built largely of timber, where the living gathered, feasted, and lived. Durrington Walls was essentially a builder's town, with houses and middens full of animal bones from great feasts. The two were connected by the River Avon and a ceremonial avenue, one monument for the dead, one for the living, joined by water. The arrangement was not accidental. It was a map of a worldview. The dead in permanent stone, the living in temporary wood, and a river flowing between them. This is why the cremated remains matter so much. The people buried in the Aubrey Holes were not random. Many were men, and their placement suggests this was an honor reserved for a select few, the ancestors around whom the whole monument was arranged. To be buried at Stonehenge was to be made permanent. These were the remembered dead, the founders, given the most prestigious address in the landscape. So, if you were a Neolithic person, what would it have meant to have your bones laid to rest inside the most powerful circle of stone in your world? The dead were one half of the story. The sky was the other. Because Stonehenge does not just face the ancestors, it faces specific points on the horizon, points where the sun and the moon do predictable things on predictable days. And those alignments are so precise that they cannot be an accident. So how do you build a monument that doubles as a clock for the heavens, 5,000 years before writing? A calendar in stone. You do it by watching the horizon for a lifetime, and then arranging the stones to mark what you saw. The most famous alignment at Stonehenge is the one almost everyone has heard of. On the midsummer sunrise, the sun rises directly over the heel stone and into the center of the avenue, flooding the monument with light. The reverse holds for the midwinter sunset, which sets perfectly between the great trilithons. Midwinter, not midsummer, may have been the more important festival to the builders. The dying year, not the living one, drew the crowds, but the builders were tracking more than the sun. 4 small stones near the edge of the monument, the station stones, frame positions on the horizon that mark the major lunar standstill, an 18-and-a-half-year cycle in which the moon's rising point swings to its furthest extremes. This is the same cycle that some recent videos have wrapped in speculation about hidden patterns in the pit spacing. The cycle itself is real. The hidden pattern claims are not well supported. The moon really does swing through that long cycle, and the stones really do track it. A real cycle does not need a secret code to be impressive. This is a good place to be honest about the limits of pattern finding. It is tempting to take the spacing of the Aubrey Holes or the angles of the stones and find a mathematical wave or a secret code in them. But the human eye is brilliant at finding patterns in random numbers, and a machine asked to look for patterns will find them whether they are meaningful or not. The alignments that hold up are the ones you can stand inside and verify on the right day of the year. Everything else is interpretation, and interpretation is where the wishful thinking creeps in. And those alignments are extraordinary enough on their own. A circle of stones that marks the turning of the seasons, and the long swing of the moon, and the place of the dead all at once is a serious piece of cosmology built into the ground. Whatever else Stonehenge was, it was also an instrument, a way of nailing the movements of the sky to a single fixed point on the earth. It did not need gears or dials. It needed patience, observation, and stone. So by now, the picture has filled in considerably. We know where the stones came from, in 3 corners of Britain. We know at least some were carried from an older monument in Wales. We know the site was a cemetery of the ancestors aligned to the sun and the moon. And yet the one thing we cannot do is point to a single answer and say, this is what Stonehenge was for. So why will there probably never be one clean solution? Why no single answer will ever be enough? Because Stonehenge was not one thing. It was built and rebuilt over roughly 1,500 years in at least 5 major phases by generations of people who almost certainly did not share a single purpose. The people who dug the first ditch around 3000 BC were not the same people who raised the Great Sarsens 500 years later, and neither group left us a written explanation. They left stones, and stones, as it turns out, can be read, but only with the right tools. Reading them took thousands of years. So the honest answer is that Stonehenge was probably all of the things the competing theories say it was, just not all at the same time. It was a cemetery. It was an ancestor monument built from the stones of a homeland. It was a solar and lunar calendar. It was almost certainly a place of pilgrimage and political gathering, a monument whose sheer scale announced the power of the community that could build it. Each of these purposes has its defenders among serious scholars, and they are not all wrong. A cemetery can also be a calendar. A calendar can also be a political statement. What the recent science has done is settle the questions that can be settled. We now know definitively where the stones came from: Scotland, Wales, and the woods of Wiltshire. We know how they likely moved, by boats, sledges, and organized labor on a scale that surprises even the experts. The where and the how are, for the first time, genuinely answered, not by an algorithm, but by geochemistry, isotopes, and decades of digging. No algorithm handed these answers down. This is what real progress on an ancient mystery looks like: slow, peer-reviewed, and built on evidence you can hold in your hand. One thing stays open, and that is the why, the part people actually care about. It is also the part no instrument can measure, because it lived in the heads of people who have been dead for 4,000 years. So when someone claims a single machine has finally solved Stonehenge, what are they really claiming to have decoded? The truth is that Stonehenge was never one mystery. It was hundreds layered over a millennium and a half, and each generation added its own. The science of the last decade has stripped away the fantasy and left something more remarkable in its place: a monument built by ordinary people with stone axes and bone tools, who nonetheless moved a block from Scotland and a circle from Wales to mark the dead and the sky. No aliens required, no lost super civilization, just people with bone tools and boats and an extraordinary capacity for organized labor. AI didn't solve the Stonehenge mystery. It was solved by a chemistry lab that traced a stone from Scotland, by quarries in Wales, and decades of digging. The truth is wilder than the headline: a monument stitched from 3 corners of Britain, built to track the sky and the dead. Is the real Stonehenge more impressive than the myth? Would you carry a stone that far? Leave a comment of your thoughts down below.